So to start with the term social innovation, which is a bit of an awkward term when you come from a social-technical background, it's an emerging field of research, just like sharing economy, that partly builds on transition studies, but also has other traditions that it builds on. So the way it has been defined so far is that it's about a combination or about new social practices or new combinations of social practices, and other schools have defined it more in terms of changing social relations. Our working definition combines these different interpretations and defines social innovation as a change in social relations that involves new ways of doing, organizing, knowing, and framing. So obviously, a lot of social innovation still involves technological innovation. So for instance, if you take the example of community energy, there is a lot of technological innovation going on there with solar panels, these technologies that enable decentralized energy production. But what is socially innovative about this is that it involves new types of social relations. So first of all, new relations between neighbors, for instance, new ways of engaging with energy, like going to your roof and taking care of your solar panel. But it also leads to new relations between producers and consumers. So it's both social and technological, but what we aim to do with this term social innovation is to really specify what is the socially innovative thing about it. There is an increasing attention for social innovation in the public debate, and there are very high expectations of it, such as this report by the Bureau of European Policy Advisors, who claim that social innovation basically is the solution to budgetary constraints. And also, former EU President said that if encouraged and valued, social innovation can bring immediate solutions to the pressing social issues that citizens are confronted with. So there's a lot of attention for this, also a lot of subsidies for research. Where there's public interest, there is money to do research, which is always nice. So I have the privilege of being involved in this project and leading this very exciting project on transformative social innovation theory. And we are in the middle of it. It just started last year, and it runs until the end of 2017. And basically what I want to do in this very short presentation is to say a little bit about our empirical research so far on the networks that we have been studying. So I will say more about those. So the research question, basically we want to kind of question this assumption that social innovation leads to societal transformation or sustainability transitions or whatever you want to call. There's this assumption in the public debate, and we want to question how and to what extent can social innovation contribute to such societal transformation, and how and to what extent are people empowered in this process. So we really focus on this idea of transformative social innovation as the process by which social innovation contributes to wider societal change. And there's, of course, a big theoretical challenge there where we build on transition studies, actor network theory, relational approaches. But I'm not going to talk about the theoretical challenges. If you want to know more about that, I can send you all sorts of deliverables. But I'm going to focus really on the empirical study, which is about initiatives that work on social innovation and have a kind of a transformative ambition to make the world more sustainable, resilient, just, or whatever. And we have decided to focus on networks that really operate at a transnational level, but also are really locally active. So globally connected, locally active. And our particular project is really focused on Europe and Latin America. And our case studies are embedded. So we look at these networks at the transnational level, but then we also zoom in and do more in-depth case studies at two local manifestations. So in total, the whole project aims to study 20 networks and 40 local manifestations. So far, we have looked at 12 transnational networks that we have done case studies on in 13 different countries. So you can see here some examples like credit unions, a network of different type of credit cooperatives, time banks, which is many of you probably know, exchanging time. The Transition Towns network, which is very much about grassroots communities working on local resilience. The Living Knowledge network. So we are working on quite diverse types of networks. So we have already finished the first case reports and summaries and one synthesis report, which is all online. And we have an emerging paper, which is not there yet because we just finished our case study reports, which is about comparing these networks in terms of how they relate to the sharing economy and other types of new economies. So this is, of course, quite a challenging thing, first of all, because it's so many authors, but also because there's a lot of diversity across the cases. First of all, you have something like the Impact Hub, which is really about social entrepreneurship. It's a franchise. It includes a lot of for-profit elements. Then you have something completely different, which is the Global Eco-Village Network, which is a network of hundreds of eco-villages, which are really intentional communities where people live. So it's really a very different sphere than the social entrepreneurship. Then you have the Fab Labs, which is really about workshops where people make stuff, which is also quite a different approach. And then you have, for instance, RIPES, which is the International Network for the Promotion of Local Solidarity Economy, which is really much more of a political lobby movement. So they're really quite different things. What I want to share with you is the three kind of things that they have in common and three insights in that regard. Well, first of all, what they have in common is that they all explicitly really have narratives on new economy. We didn't even explicitly ask them about them, but this came up in each and single case study really had ambitions to contribute to new economies. And just here are some examples of the kind of words that they use on their websites and in their interviews when they are explaining what they aim to do. And as you can see, there is all sorts of new economies: the social, the circular, the green, the solidary, the collaborative, etc. And also we see that the sharing economy is mentioned many times. Now, the interesting thing is that we notice that obviously these narratives of new economies are obviously not just from the networks themselves, but really relate to larger societal discourses. And we are analyzing that in terms of narratives of change. So these are societal discourses on change and innovation that these initiatives play into. So it's not like they are inventing them, it's much more they're out there and they're playing into them. And we argue that we see that these narratives of change often respond to certain what we call game changers. So these are macro developments, in transition lingo, the landscape. So these are kind of macro developments that are really perceived to change the game, to put pressure on the existing system. So for example, globalization, climate change, the economic crisis. And you see that these narratives of change really respond to these game changers, but also reframe them. And that social initiatives quite strategically, actually, which is really underestimated because people think it's cute and grassroots, but they quite strategically play into these discursive dynamics. A really good example is the Transition Towns Network, which really started off much more focused on peak oil and climate change. Then when the global economic crisis hit, they really reframed and not necessarily only strategically, because they also saw that that's where the challenges were. They really reframed their work in terms of building local resilience and local economy. So you really see how these initiatives reframe themselves in response to societal discourses and global game changers. In the meantime, while they do this, while they're very strategic into playing these narratives, in the meantime, they really hold on to their, at the same time, to their kind of core idea. So, for instance, this is an eco-village in the south of Portugal where I did participant observation. And there they also talk a lot about new economy, sharing economy, but then when you ask them what do they mean by it, they really go back to their understanding, their theory of change of what needs to happen, which in this case is really about community work. So here I thought this was a nice quote where they say, economy is always a reflection of a social behavior, and so if you need to look at this if you want to change the economy also. If we build a new currency, we need to anchor it in a new social system, in new social behavior. Because if I don't trust people, also the gift economy doesn't work. And he or she really expressed that they had very strong doubts about new economy initiatives that weren't based in real community work. So they really start off from, you first have to change your community relations, relearn to live in community before you can actually work with alternative economy. Interesting, the Impact Hub network, which is a completely different context, much more entrepreneurial, also much more business-oriented. They have a bit of a different approach. They have like 63 different impact hubs around the world where social entrepreneurs are co-working and collaborating. And they particularly have a very strong discourse on the sharing economy. Also many of their members, so many of the social entrepreneurs who are members of the Impact Hub are sharing economy entrepreneurs. So they really create new sharing economy platforms like Connected in the Impact Hub Amsterdam. But also when you ask them about like what brings people here and what's behind this new economy stuff, they also emphasize that it's about new social relations. So they also emphasize that it's about the quality of relations, and that what brings people to the Impact Hub is that they're building a new kind of society. And when I then ask, well, like, what kind of new society would they be, they emphasize that it's a society in which the relations are based on trust, courage, and collaboration. Interestingly, this is their slogan that is shared globally, because, for instance, social economy is something that in the more Eastern Russian context is like contested concept. So they don't use these kind of terms at the global level because they need to get all cultural and political context on board. But this is something that the global community really agrees on. This is what they want, a future based on trust, courage, and collaboration. So my final point that I would like to discuss is that what we also see is obviously that, and we have been discussing this at this conference, that all these social innovations come with all sorts of political power struggles. But not only are these struggles a consequence or impact of social innovation, which is often how they are discussed, but I would argue that the shifting and the contestation of the power relations, that is the social innovation. If you understand it in terms of new social relations, then that inherently entails power struggles. That is what the social innovation is about finding new relations. So in order to meaningfully discuss that and also critically discuss that, you need to, of course, have a sense of actor categories and institutional logics. And here you see that a lot of the social innovation debate and also the sharing economy debate, as I saw some of the presentations yesterday. Oh, perfect. I could slow down. A lot of the debates I also heard yesterday kind of are based on this division between market, state, and civil society, which you, of course, all know as a very typical categorization. And then you have, of course, the triple helix understanding, which is very popular in innovation studies, which is much more about the triad between academia, industry, and government. And then, of course, as we scientists do, we invented the quadruple helix, and somebody even invented the quintuple helix. I'm quite a fan of this model, the welfare mix made by Pestov, and I think this is particularly interesting because it makes a distinction between the formal and the informal economy. So we have used this model to kind of develop a multi-actor heuristic to discuss shifting power relations in these social innovation initiatives. So it's based on the division between public and private, for-profit and non-profit, and formal and informal. And I think that's a very important one when we're discussing social innovation and sharing economy phenomena, is that there is a big distinction between this formal and informal phenomena. Now, the interesting thing is that obviously this is a very black and white picture. And then we start discussing, there's a lot of discussions about social innovation. It's only social innovation if it comes from the community. Otherwise, it's not really social innovation, these kind of discussions. But if you look at our case studies, they are all, legally third sector because they're networks, so therefore they're associations and foundations. But if you look at how they really operate on the boundaries between these different sectors and institutional logics. And not only do they operate on the boundaries, they are actually very actively involved in renegotiating what those boundaries are and what they should be. For instance, if you look at the boundary between non-profit and for-profit, probably you all know this concept of not-for-profit, this kind of weird in-between. And the social enterprise is a typical example of something that is for-profit, but not only, it's also non-profit, so it combines the two logics. And a network like the Impact Hub has been very important in kind of negotiating this discourse that people who go to the Impact Hub, for them it's often an enlightenment, like social entrepreneurs who like leave their job and they kind of discover like, okay, so it's okay to make money and also do good for society. So for them it's kind of a rediscovery that that's possible, and that's one of the really big things that the Impact Hub is working on, to really kind of try to get rid of that dichotomy. The same can be said about science. Where should science be? Where is science located? That is obviously a political debate. To what extent should it be commercial, state-funded? And a network like the Living Knowledge, the network of science shops, is also very much about seeing like how can you involve community and citizens more in science? How can we arrange that science also much more about accommodating what they want to have researched? Also the question about where is sharing. So there's yesterday a lot of discussion about what is real sharing and what not. Obviously in each of these institutional logics, it has a very different understanding of what it is. And it's also about negotiating how, for instance, the state deals with such sharing practices in different institutional logics. To give an example, the Time Banks network is busy negotiating with the UK government how the reciprocal exchange can be exempted from taxation. So there is a negotiation of how to deal with that. And the same can be said about all sorts of other things like media and religion. It's all about refinding the boundaries. To end, a lot of the critical debates, of course, is when like this picture looks all very like as if it's all equal. But of course, if you could argue that the world looks a bit more like this in the past few decades, where a lot of our public services have been outsourced to the state and the welfare state and the market and the public-private partnership, so that these are very dominant, and that there are worries about the sharing economy. Some people see the sharing economy or Airbnb as like informality growing, but of course the critique is that it's actually the other way around, that the market is actually penetrating your bedroom and your living room. All these discussions that we are having here, which are very important discussions and very relevant, but at the same time I do think that sometimes we focus too much about discussions about between market and community and state. And I think another thing that would be interesting to do is to zoom much more specifically into these different institutional logics and look at the different individual roles that are in there. So a citizen is not just in the community, it's obviously also participating in the state as voters. I'm almost done. As voters, and also we are participating in the market as consumers. So, and I think some of the more worrisome power struggles and inequalities are also between, like when you zoom in onto the micropolitics, between these different individual roles. So I would like to kind of call for a reorientation of power discussions to also be more about the micropolitics between individuals. So conclusion, my very final slide. I think social innovation is an interesting concept for sharing economy, first of all because sharing economy can be seen as a form of social innovation. But it also has an important role for all kinds of other, it enables all kinds of other social innovations and vice versa. All kinds of other social innovations like eco-villages also enable the growth of sharing economy. I think sharing economy and other new economies can be studied as narratives of change that respond to these global game changers like climate change and economic crisis. And I think we want to do more research, discursive research, and understanding how this is strategically used by these initiatives. And last but not least, what I just said about the importance of micropolitics. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Flor. So I invite all of you to ask questions or give comments on this interesting presentation.
Thanks, Flor, for a very inspiring and a very good presentation. One thing I kind of missed, because, and this is what you said, taking technology out of innovation is kind of awkward. Well, all these initiatives are basically based on having innovation, having these networks. I mean, they're all built on the new technology that's around. And I kind of also miss that. You use a rather classic picture of the different sectors in society. I think it works quite well, but still you miss the dynamics of the innovation and the role of technology in itself. And how could you include it in your story, or do you think you can have innovation without technology?
No, I think obviously... Oh, sorry. Shall I wait for you to collect, or should I answer?
No, you can.
Okay. So I completely agree. It's all socio-technical, and especially if we have a complex relational aspect, everything is co-produced and related to everything. So in our theoretical work, we're really focused on creating a much more complex understanding, which maybe even questions the whole word social innovation. So obviously in our case studies we are looking at the role of technology. But I still think that it's useful to talk about social innovation, because I do think that even social technical studies sometimes talk about the technological innovation, but then they look at the social in terms of the social dimension of technological innovation. And sometimes we forget to specify what is socially innovative about it. So I think that's why it's a useful concept, but of course we need to not forget that it's linked to many other things.
Connected to that, because that was a question about the role of technology, but you could also say that you focus a lot on the role of power, but is there also maybe that you take into account knowledge, so the cognitive dimension? Because if you have these associations in the middle, they need to bridge different kinds of institutional logics, but also different kinds of cognitive backgrounds, I would say. And also because you focused on, or your empirical focus is on local projects which connect to global initiatives, I can imagine that there's a lot of knowledge interaction going from local to global and vice versa. Could you react on that, the role of cognitive or learning, so to say?
Shall I? Yeah. So this is a very important dimension. We also I didn't have time to present our whole conceptual framework, but it specifically includes new ways of knowing and framing, which is very much about different types of knowledge and knowledge co-production. And also these narratives of change are, of course, very dependent on how scientific understandings and other types of more tacit knowledge understandings. So this is definitely important role. I just didn't have time to go into it. Yeah.
So thanks. That's a great presentation. And it sounds like a fantastic project. In some ways, some of what you're doing is similar to what we were interested in doing in our project. It's we have a smaller range of cases, but we're interested in, on the one hand, are these models that can scale, and number two, what is the extent to which they actually achieve their goals? And so, one of the things we're finding is that the nonprofits are true to mission, but they can't scale. The for-profits are veering away from mission as they scale. And I'm curious how you're measuring that transformation, and sort of, are you measuring it against a fixed sort of set of outcomes, mission of the networks themselves? And could you talk a little bit more about your methods of assessment with the case studies?
Yeah. So our project is quantitative, so we're combining qualitative case studies with not necessarily quantitative, but more comparative meta-analysis. So far we only did really in-depth case studies, which are very based on interviews, participant observations, so there it's really difficult to measure the actual impact. So first, conceptually, we are conceptualizing transformative change as institutional change. So we measure or look to what extent these initiatives really lead to or engage with institutional change. So we can do that qualitatively, but the problem is, of course, that these things are long-term, and so we are not looking back historically. We didn't look back historically. So for the next batch of empirical case studies, we will actually look back historically more, and also we are going to look at critical turning points. So we're going to have not a survey, but they're still figuring out the exact methods, but we're going to increase the amount of cases to about 200, and we're going to try to find what were the critical turning points in which the initiatives critically engaged with institutional change. And we're going to try to have a kind of process understanding of the different moments of institutional confrontation.
So institutions outside themselves.
Yeah. So the social initiatives as part of a social context, and the social context has all sorts of institutions and structures, because if you have a relational approach, it's problematic to talk about social technical systems. This is whole negotiation within the project, but so it's institutional. The social context, to what extent are these initiatives challenging, altering, and or replacing that's dominant institutions and structures in that social context? But there's a whole theory deliverable that might interest you that I can share with you.
Thanks a lot. I really like your approach in which you try to understand the institutional logics behind this and how the actors combine these institutional logics. This reminds me of a project that colleagues of mine are currently working on, in which they are also looking at NGOs and how they talk about evaluations and measurements of what they are doing, of their performance and so on. There they also identified that there are certain and different institutional logics which are combined in the discourses, And what I found interesting is that they find that some organizations choose to stick to one of the logics or two, while others choose to combine arguments from all the logics. And they point to how important these actors are in the mixing these different logics, in spreading these ideas, and how well connected they are, and how they facilitate this transitional change somehow. Do you have similar observations, so to speak, that there's a large variety in how the organizations combine these arguments, or do you see this mixture of argumentations and of institutional logics being addressed for all organizations?
No, I think there's a lot of diversity. So some initiatives focus much more on the interaction between community, informal community and the state, while others really try to combine all of it. But I would say that most of them are focused on 1, 2, or 3, but not all 4, I would argue. And monitoring is also an important challenge that we're looking at, because one of the things that all these initiatives, they do a lot on social learning. They do a lot with governance, innovative governance structures. They have a lot with innovative ways of resourcing and crowdsourcing and all that. But monitoring, how to monitor their progress and especially monitoring their impact is something that they really struggle with. So this is something that we're also really looking into. I think I have to stop.
Yes, thank you very much, Flor.
Thank
well
you.
done.